Welcome, travelers of the Imperium. Tonight, we journey through the ages to explore the life, deeds, and legacy of the most powerful being humanity has ever known, the Emperor of mankind. Let yourself relax as we delve into the deep history of the Master of mankind, the anathema to chaos, the Omnissiah made flesh. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the tale of the immortal Emperor unfold before you like the pages of an ancient tome, preserved in the deepest vaults of terror. In the ancient days of humanity, long before the rise of civilization as we know it, in the age when mankind still huddled in caves and feared the darkness, something extraordinary occurred. The shamans of humanity, those proto-psychers who could touch the warp, foresaw a terrible future. They witnessed the gradual corruption of the Imperium, the realm of souls, and understood that individually they would be consumed by the predatory entities dwelling there. These shamans, these wise men and women scattered across prehistoric Earth, made a decision that would echo through eternity. They gathered in a secret place in the heartlands of ancient Anatolia and performed a ritual unprecedented in human history. One by one, they took their own lives, each timing their death precisely, so that their souls would not dissipate into the warp, but instead merge together into a single, unified consciousness. The ritual succeeded beyond their wildest imaginings. Their souls coalesced, merged, and reincarnated into a single child, born approximately 8,000 years before the first millennium. This child possessed the collected wisdom, psychic might, and purpose of thousands of ancient human shamans. This child was the being who would become known as the Emperor of mankind. From his very first breath, this child was different. He was immortal, or as close to true immortality as any being could achieve. He was a perpetual, capable of regenerating from almost any wound, immune to disease and the ravages of time. But more than this, he possessed psychic power on a scale never before witnessed in the material universe. For millennia, the Emperor walked among humanity in secret. He took countless names, countless faces, countless roles. He was never content to rule openly, for he understood that humanity needed to evolve, to grow, to make its own mistakes and learn from them. But he was always there, guiding from the shadows, pushing humanity forward incrementally, ensuring that the species would survive and thrive. In ancient Sumeria, he may have been a wise priest king who taught humanity the secrets of agriculture and writing. In Egypt, perhaps he was an architect who understood principles of mathematics and engineering far beyond his time. In ancient Greece, he might have been a philosopher, teaching logic and reason. In Rome, a general who understood strategy and discipline. The emperor learned patience during these long ages. He witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. He saw humanity's greatest triumphs and most devastating failures. He walked through the classical age, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, always watching, always learning, always planning for a future only he could see. During the Age of Terror, before humanity reached for the stars, the Emperor quietly influenced the development of science and technology. He ensured that certain discoveries were made at the right times, that certain individuals were in the right places to make breakthrough insights. He was never the face of progress, but he was often the whisper in the darkness that pointed the way forward. Then came the calamity known as the Age of Strife. The old night that nearly destroyed humanity forever. The birth of Slaanesh in the warp created psychic shockwaves that tore through reality. Warp storms erupted across the galaxy, severing the interstellar civilization that humanity had built during the dark age of technology. Worlds were isolated, cut off from all contact with the rest of human space. On some worlds, civilization collapsed entirely, regressing to barbarism. On others, technology failed catastrophically, leading to mass death and suffering. Artificial intelligences turned on their creators in what became known as the Cybernetic Revolt. Xenos races invaded vulnerable human colonies. Warp entities possessed entire populations. Terra itself was not spared. The cradle of humanity descended into an age of techno-barbarism, with warlords wielding archaeotech weapons, fighting over the irradiated wastelands. Nations rose and fell in the span of decades. The planet that had once been blue and green became a polluted hive of endless war. The Emperor watched all of this with growing concern. He had hoped that humanity would weather this storm, would find its own way through the darkness. But as the centuries of the age of strife stretched on, he realized that without intervention, humanity would destroy itself or be destroyed by the forces that circled it like vultures. The time for subtlety had passed. The time for revelation had come. In the late 29th millennium, the Emperor finally stepped out of the shadows. He revealed himself to the scattered tribes and techno-barbarian kingdoms of Terra, and he did so with a purpose that could not be denied. He was no longer content to guide and suggest. Humanity needed a firm hand, a clear vision, and the strength to achieve it. The Emperor appeared as a golden figure of impossible majesty. He stood taller than any man, his presence radiating power and authority. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. When he commanded, armies followed. He was charismatic beyond measure, his very presence inspiring loyalty and devotion in those who stood before him. But the Emperor did not reveal his true nature fully. He did not claim to be a god, for he understood the dangers of religion, the ways it had been used throughout history to control and limit humanity. Instead, he presented himself as the pinnacle of human evolution, the next step that humanity must strive toward. He preached the Imperial truth, that there were no gods, only aliens and ancient technology, that humanity's destiny was to rule the stars, that reason and science would light the way forward. To unify Terra, the Emperor needed warriors unlike any who had come before. Using his vast knowledge of genetics and biology, knowledge gathered over tens of thousands of years, he created the first of his superhuman soldiers, the Thunder Warriors. These warriors were brutal, powerful beings, created through crude but effective genetic enhancement. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, possessed strength that could shatter stone, and were engineered to know neither fear nor mercy. They were the perfect weapons for the savage wars that would follow. The Emperor did not create the Thunder Warriors alone. He worked with brilliant scientists and geneticists, chief among them Ama Astarte, who would lend her name to the future Astartes, though she worked primarily on the Thunder Warriors during the Unification Wars. These warriors were organized into 20 regiments, each 1,000 strong. They were given the finest weapons that could be manufactured, armor that could withstand small arms fire, and an unshakable loyalty to their creator. They were not meant to be subtle. They were a hammer, and the Emperor would use them to strike down all who opposed the unification of Terra. The Unification Wars began in earnest in the final years of the 29th millennium. The Emperor led his Thunder Warriors out from the Himalayan mountains, where he had established his primary fortress laboratory. His first targets were the techno-barbarian kingdoms that controlled the regions surrounding his stronghold. One by one, the kingdoms fell. The Emperor offered each warlord the same choice: submit peacefully and be integrated into his growing Imperium, or resist and face annihilation. Some chose wisely and bent the knee. Others, proud and defiant, chose to fight. Those who fought learned the futility of resistance. The Thunder Warriors were unstoppable in battle. They charged through gunfire that would have cut down normal men, shrugged off wounds that should have been fatal, and butchered their enemies with methodical efficiency. Entire armies broke and fled before them. The Emperor himself often led from the front lines, clad in golden armor and wielding weapons of incredible power. He was a one-man army. He could obliterate scores of enemies with a gesture, his psychic might manifesting as golden fire that consumed all it touched. Enemies who sought to challenge him in single combat were cut down before they could even swing their weapons. But the Emperor was not merely a warlord. He was a builder, a statesman, a visionary. As he conquered each region, he immediately began the process of reconstruction. He repaired infrastructure, restored order, implemented systems of governance. He conscripted the conquered peoples into his armies, putting them to work, rebuilding Terra, and preparing for the greater wars to come. The Unification Wars were not a single continuous campaign, but rather a series of major conflicts interspersed with periods of consolidation and preparation. Each major techno-barbarian kingdom required its own strategy, its own approach. The Pan-Pacific Empire, which controlled much of the former Pacific Rim, was one of the first major powers to fall. They fielded vast armies equipped with recovered archaeotech, but even their most powerful weapons could not stand against the Thunder Warriors. The Emperor's forces stormed their fortress cities one by one, until finally the Pan-Pacific throne itself fell. The Indonesian bloc controlled territories in what had once been Southeast Asia. They were ruled by gene witches who had twisted themselves and their subjects into bizarre forms through reckless genetic experimentation. The Emperor found their practices abhorrent, a perversion of the sciences he held sacred. He showed them no mercy, purging their bloodlines entirely and putting their territories under strict oversight. The Nordafric conclaves were a coalition of kingdoms that controlled the irradiated deserts of northern Africa. They possessed powerful energy weapons and maintained massive tank formations. The war against them was brutal and protracted, but ultimately, the Emperor's superior tactics and the sheer ferocity of his Thunder Warriors won the day. Perhaps the most significant conquest was that of the Mechanicum of Mars. The Red Planet had weathered the age of strife better than Terra, maintaining much of its technological base and even advancing in certain areas. The Martian tech priests worshipped the machine god and viewed technology as sacred. The Emperor could have waged war against Mars, but he chose a different path. He approached the Mechanicum diplomatically, and in a stroke of political genius, allowed them to believe that he was the Omnisire, the physical manifestation of their machine god. Whether he truly believed himself to be their prophesied savior, or whether this was a calculated deception remains a matter of debate, but the result was clear. Mars allied itself with Terra, bringing its forges, its weapons, and its vast fleets to the Emperor's cause. The last holdouts against the Emperor's unification were the most fanatical, the most desperate. These were warlords who understood that surrender meant the end of their power, their way of life. They fortified their territories, gathered their most loyal followers, and prepared for a final, apocalyptic battle. The Emperor obliged them. The final years of the Unification Wars saw some of the most brutal fighting in Terra's history. Entire regions were reduced to radioactive ash. Mountains were leveled by orbital bombardment. Ancient cities, some dating back to before the Age of Strife, were destroyed in the fighting. One of the final major campaigns was against a warlord who controlled the ancient ruins of what had once been the Euro-African hive cities. This warlord had access to a cache of Dark Age technology, including weapons that could crack open the very crust of the planet. The Emperor personally led the final assault on this warlord's fortress, fighting through armies of augmented soldiers and automated defense systems. The battle was said to have lasted 3 days and 3 nights without pause. The Emperor's psychic might lit up the sky like a second sun. When it was over, the warlord lay dead, his fortress in ruins, and the last significant opposition to the Emperor's rule had been crushed. By approximately 798.M30, the Unification Wars were complete. Terra was unified under the Emperor's rule for the first time in human history, but the victory had come at a terrible cost. Terra was more devastated than ever, its population reduced by decades of brutal warfare. The oceans had boiled away, the atmosphere was barely breathable in many regions, and radiation levels remained dangerously high across vast swathes of territory. And then there were the Thunder Warriors. These magnificent warriors, who had fought so loyally for their creator, were flawed. They were unstable, their genetic enhancements causing them to degenerate over time. They were aggressive, difficult to control once the fighting stopped. The Emperor, always thinking ahead, understood that they were weapons of unification, not of consolidation. What happened next remains one of the darkest chapters in Imperial history. The Thunder Warriors were gathered for what they believed would be a final triumph, a celebration of their victories. Instead, they were betrayed. At Mount Ararat, the Thunder Warriors were massacred by the very Imperium they had fought to create, cut down by the Emperor's new creations, the Space Marine Legions. Some Thunder Warriors escaped the purge, surviving as hunted fugitives in the wastes of Terra. But their time had passed. A new age was beginning, and the Emperor had already moved on to his next great project. Even as the Unification Wars raged, the Emperor had been working on something far more ambitious than the Thunder Warriors. He understood that to conquer the galaxy, to reunify the scattered colonies of humanity spread across 1 million worlds, he would need not just warriors, but leaders, generals, heroes who could inspire entire armies and govern vast territories. Thus began the Primarch project, the Emperor's greatest genetic achievement. Using his own genetic material as a template, along with secrets drawn from the warp and sciences that even the Mechanicum could barely comprehend, the Emperor began crafting 20 sons. These would not be mere soldiers. Each Primarch was designed to be a demigod, possessing not only superhuman physical capabilities, but also unique gifts tailored to specific purposes. One might be a master of siege warfare, another a diplomat without peer, a third a berserker of unstoppable fury, and yet another a genius of stealth and subterfuge. The Emperor worked in secret laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains. He poured decades of effort into the project, obsessing over every detail. Each Primarch was to be perfect in their own way, a reflection of a different aspect of the Emperor himself, magnified and specialized. But the Emperor was not working unobserved. The Chaos Gods, those malevolent entities that lurked in the warp, had taken notice of the Emperor's actions. They saw in him a threat to their dominance over humanity, and they sought to thwart his plans. In what the Emperor would later call his greatest failure, the Chaos Gods struck. They tore open a rift in reality directly into the Emperor's laboratories. Before the Emperor could react, before he could defend his creations, the 20 incubation pods containing the infant Primarchs were seized by warp energies and scattered across the galaxy. The Emperor's rage at this theft was said to have been terrible to behold. He scoured the laboratories, searching for any clue as to where his sons had been taken. But the trail was cold. The Primarchs were gone, cast into the void, and there was nothing he could do to retrieve them immediately. But the Emperor was nothing if not resilient. He would not allow this setback to destroy his plans. He still possessed the genetic templates, the knowledge of how to create his superhuman warriors. If he could not have his 20 generals immediately, he would create their soldiers first and find his sons later. From the genetic samples of each Primarch, the Emperor created the gene seed, the biological mechanism that would transform ordinary humans into space marines, the Adeptus Astartes. These warriors would not be as powerful as the Primarchs, but they would be far superior to the Thunder Warriors in every way that mattered. Space Marines were more stable, longer lived, and more controllable. They could think and adapt, not just fight. They could serve for centuries without degradation. They were the perfect soldiers for a prolonged campaign of galactic conquest. The Emperor created 20 legions, each using the gene seed of one of the lost Primarchs. Though the Primarchs themselves were scattered, their genetic legacy would serve the Imperium. These legions were numbered, and they began the work of conquering the galaxy, even as the search for the Primarchs continued. In 798 M30, the Emperor launched the Great Crusade. Using ships constructed in the forges of Mars and crewed by billions of Imperial army soldiers and support personnel, the Emperor led humanity out into the stars. The goal was simple: find every human world, bring them into compliance with the Imperium, and eliminate any threat to humanity's dominance. The Emperor took personal command of the crusade in its early years. He led from the flagship, the colossal battleship that served as both a mobile fortress and a symbol of imperial might. World after world fell before the advancing crusade fleets. Some worlds welcomed the Imperium with open arms, grateful to be reunited with Terra after the long isolation of the Age of Strife. These worlds were integrated peacefully, their populations joining the Imperial army, their resources directed toward the Crusade's endless appetite for supplies. Other worlds resisted. Perhaps they had built their own civilizations during the Age of Strife and did not wish to surrender their independence. Perhaps they had been corrupted by chaos or dominated by xeno species. Perhaps they simply did not believe that the emperor's claims were legitimate. Regardless of their reasons, the punishment for resistance was brutal. Worlds that refused compliance were subjected to devastating military assaults. The Space Marine legions would descend from orbit like angels of death, their drop pods screaming through the atmosphere. They would seize strategic positions, decapitate enemy leadership, and break the will of any defense. If resistance continued, orbital bombardment would reduce cities to rubble. If even that failed, the world would be subject to exterminatus, the total annihilation of all life on the planet. The Emperor did not take pleasure in such destruction, but neither did he hesitate to order it. He had seen the dangers that lurked in the galaxy, the predatory xenos, the corrupting influence of chaos, the potential for human civilizations to devolve into barbarism or develop technologies that threatened reality itself. He believed with absolute conviction that only through unity under his rule could humanity survive. As the Great Crusade pushed deeper into the galaxy, the Emperor kept part of his attention always focused on finding his lost sons. He used his psychic powers to search the warp, looking for the distinctive psychic signatures of the Primarchs. He sent scout fleets ahead of the main crusade to investigate any world that showed unusual readings or strange reports. One by one, the Primarchs were found. Each had landed on a different world. Each had been shaped by the culture and circumstances of that world, and each had risen to prominence in their own way. Horus was found on the brutal gang world of Chthoniya, where he had become a charismatic gang leader. Leman Russ was discovered on the frozen death world of Fenris, where he had been raised by wolves and become a legendary warrior king. Robert Gilliman was found on the civilized world of Macraga, where he had become a brilliant administrator and military leader, ruling a sector of space with wisdom and efficiency. Each discovery was a moment of joy for the Emperor. He would descend to the planet personally, reveal himself to his son, and bring them into the fold of the Imperium. Most Primarchs recognized the Emperor immediately, feeling an instinctive connection to their creator. They swore fealty without hesitation and took command of their respective legions. The reunification of each Primarch with their legion was transformative. The Space Marines of each legion recognized their gene father and welcomed them with fierce loyalty. The Primarchs, in turn, reshaped their legions to reflect their own philosophies and combat doctrines. Gilliman transformed his Ultramarines into a model of efficiency and adaptability, creating the Codex Astartes that would serve as a template for Space Marine organization. Rogel Dawn led his Imperial Fists to specialize in siege warfare and defensive operations. Conrad Kurz twisted his Night Lords into a force of terror and psychological warfare. Not all reunions were smooth. Some Primarchs had been shaped by harsh worlds and bore deep psychological scars. Angron of the World Eaters had been enslaved as a gladiator, fitted with the butcher's nails that drove him into constant fury. Mortarion of the Death Guard had been raised by a necromancer on the toxic world of Barbarous, learning to endure suffering as a way of life. Conrad Kurz had grown up in the lightless underhive of Nostromo, becoming a creature of the night who dispensed brutal justice. The Emperor attempted to heal these wounds, to guide these damaged sons toward the light. But he was not a father in the conventional sense. He was a general, a strategist, and his attention was divided among 20 suns, countless legions, and an entire galaxy. Some of his sons felt neglected, misunderstood, or simply used as tools rather than cherished as children. For a time, it seemed as though the Emperor's dream would be realized. The Great Crusade progressed at an unprecedented pace. Thousands of worlds were brought into Imperial compliance. The legions worked together, conquering entire sectors of space. The Primarchs, despite their differences, functioned as a unified force under their father's guidance. The Imperium grew into the largest human empire in history. Entire systems were transformed from barbaric backwaters into productive, civilized worlds. Trade routes were established, connecting worlds that had been isolated for millennia. The imperial truth spread, teaching humanity to abandon superstition and embrace reason. The Emperor stood at the apex of this achievement. He was revered across the Imperium, not as a god despite his denial of divinity, but as the greatest leader humanity had ever known. Statues of him were erected on every compliant world. His image appeared on every currency, every official document, every banner. But even at the height of his triumph, there were warning signs. Reports came in of strange phenomena, of worlds that had been touched by something darker than mere barbarism. Psychers reported disturbing visions in the warp. Some space marines exhibited behaviors that their commanders could not explain. Sudden rage, paranoia, obsessive behaviors. The Emperor was aware of these signs. He understood what they meant. The Chaos Gods had not abandoned their interest in humanity. They were patient, scheming, planting the seeds of corruption that would take decades to bear fruit. One of the most significant events of the Great Crusade was the Council of Nicaea, a great conclave called by the Emperor to address the growing controversy surrounding psychic powers within the Space Marine legions. Some legions, like the Thousand Suns under Magnus the Red, had embraced the use of psychic abilities enthusiastically. They believed that the warp could be studied, understood, and controlled through discipline and knowledge. Magnus himself was perhaps the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, second only to the Emperor, and he had developed an entire system of psychic disciplines. Other Primarchs were deeply suspicious of psychers. Mortarion and Lemon Russ argued that the use of psychic powers was inherently dangerous, that it opened the user to corruption and possession by warp entities. They demanded that the use of sorcery be banned entirely. The Emperor listened to both sides present their arguments. The debate grew heated, with accusations and counter-accusations flying. Magnus passionately defended the use of psychic powers, arguing that knowledge was never dangerous in itself, only ignorance and misuse. In the end, the Emperor made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He issued the Edict of Nicaea, which banned the use of sorcery and psychic disciplines within the Space Marine legions. Only sanctioned psychers, trained and supervised by the Imperium, would be permitted to use their powers, and even then only in specific roles such as astropaths and navigators. Magnus was devastated by this decision. He felt betrayed by his father, believing that the Emperor was rejecting knowledge and progress in favor of ignorance. But Magnus was loyal, and he swore to abide by the edict, returning to his homeworld of Prospero with his legion to pursue other forms of study. The Emperor believed he had made the right choice, balancing the utility of psychic powers against their dangers. But in his pragmatic wisdom, he had underestimated the emotional impact of his decision on Magnus and failed to see how the feeling of rejection would fester. The greatest triumph of the Great Crusade came at Ullanor, where the Emperor led a massive coalition of forces against the largest Orc empire in the galaxy. The Orcs, a brutal Xenos race that lived only for war, had gathered under a powerful warlord and threatened to engulf entire sectors of Imperial space. The Emperor assembled a force unlike any seen before. Multiple Space Marine legions, billions of Imperial army soldiers, and thousands of ships converged on the Ullanor system. The campaign was brutal, with fighting taking place on hundreds of worlds simultaneously. The climax came on the world of Ullanor Prime, where the Emperor personally confronted the Orc warlord in single combat. The battle was legendary, a clash between two titans of war. The Emperor's power and skill proved superior, and he struck down the warlord, beheading it with a single blow. The victory at Ullanor marked the symbolic apex of the Great Crusade. The Orcs were scattered, their empire shattered. The Imperium stood triumphant, and it seemed as though nothing could stand against it. In the aftermath of Ullanor, the Emperor made a decision that would change everything. He announced that he was returning to Terra to work on a secret project of vital importance. The Great Crusade would continue, but it would do so under new leadership. The Emperor named Horus, his favorite son, as War Master, giving him command over all the forces of the Great Crusade. It was an unprecedented honor, elevating one Primarch above all his brothers. Horus was loved by most of his brothers and respected by all. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and had been the Emperor's companion since the earliest days of the Crusade. But the appointment sowed seeds of jealousy and resentment. Some Primarchs questioned why they had not been chosen. Others worried about what could be so important that the Emperor would abandon the Crusade at its moment of triumph. The Emperor had always been a distant father, but now he would be completely absent, leaving his sons to continue his work without his guidance. The Emperor himself believed this was necessary. His secret project, known as the Imperial Webway, would secure humanity's future by providing safe, reliable transportation across the galaxy without the need to traverse the warp. But he did not share this information with his sons, believing that secrecy was necessary for the project's success. This lack of communication would prove to be a fatal error. The Emperor had long understood that humanity's reliance on warp travel was its greatest vulnerability. Every time a ship entered the warp, it risked encountering demons, warp storms, or simply becoming lost in that nightmarish realm. Psychers were necessary to guide ships through the warp, but every psyker was a potential gateway for demonic possession. During his long life, the Emperor had learned of the Webway, an ancient network of tunnels through an alternate dimension created by the Eldar at the height of their power. The Webway allowed for instant travel across vast distances without touching the warp. It was the technology that had allowed the Eldar to build their galaxy-spanning empire. The Emperor's vision was to create a human-controlled section of the Webway, branching off from the existing Eldar network. This would allow humanity to travel the stars safely, to communicate instantly across the galaxy, and to eliminate its dependence on navigators and astropaths. It would be a technological and psychic achievement without parallel. But the project required the Emperor's personal attention. He would need to sit upon the golden throne, a device of incredible complexity that he had constructed beneath the Imperial palace. From there, he would use his vast psychic might to stabilize the new webway tunnels and defend them from warp incursions. The Emperor returned to Terra and immediately sequestered himself in the Imperial dungeon, the vast network of laboratories and workshops beneath the Imperial palace. He gathered the greatest minds of the Mechanicum, the most skilled tech priests and engineers, and set them to work on the physical construction of the webway gate. At the same time, he prepared himself for the psychic ordeal that would be required. He would need to maintain constant vigilance. His consciousness stretched across vast distances, holding back the forces of the warp that would seek to corrupt and destroy his creation. The Emperor's absence from the Great Crusade was immediately felt. Without his unifying presence, tensions among the Primarchs began to surface. Horus, as War Master, did his best to hold things together, but he was not his father. He could not command the same absolute authority, could not resolve disputes with the same finality. And in the warp, the Chaos Gods watched and waited. They had been preparing their own plan, and the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra had given them the opening they needed. The first disaster came from an unexpected source. Magnus the Red, loyal son of the Emperor, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. Magnus, despite the Edict of Nicaea, had continued to study the warp in secret. He believed that his control and understanding were sufficient to avoid any danger. Magnus discovered something terrible, a plot against the Emperor, a conspiracy among the Primarchs themselves. He saw visions of Horus's corruption, of the coming civil war that would tear the Imperium apart. Desperate to warn his father, Magnus attempted to send a psychic message to Terra. But Magnus's understanding of the warp was not as complete as he believed. His message was incredibly powerful, strong enough to cross the galaxy instantaneously. But it was also destructive. The psychic shockwave of Magnus's warning tore through the warp, shattered the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Palace, and smashed directly into the Webway project. The catastrophe was immediate and total. The carefully constructed Webway tunnels ruptured, and demons poured through the breach. The Emperor, who had been guiding the project with his psychic might, was forced to divert all his attention to sealing the breach and holding back the demonic invasion. The Emperor was furious. Magnus had not only destroyed decades of work, but had also endangered all of Terra. Worse, Magnus's message had been corrupted by its passage through the warp, arriving as incoherent fragments. The Emperor did not learn of Horus's betrayal from Magnus's warning. The Emperor dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero to bring Magnus to Terra to answer for his actions. But the order was intercepted and altered by agents of chaos. Instead of bringing Magnus back alive, Russ believed he was to execute Magnus and destroy the Thousand Suns entirely. The burning of Prospero was a tragedy. The Space Wolves descended on the homeworld of the Thousand Suns and waged a war of extermination. Magnus, grief-stricken and believing himself betrayed by his father, was pushed into the arms of the Chaos God, Tzeentch. The Thousand Suns, who had been loyal despite their forbidden studies, were forced to embrace chaos to survive. With the webway breached and demons pouring through, the Emperor had no choice. he seated himself upon the golden throne and began the work of holding back the demonic tide. Every moment of every day, he battled against the entities trying to force their way through the rift, using his psychic might to seal and reseal the breaches as they formed. This required nearly all of his attention and power. He could no longer leave Terra. He could no longer lead the Imperium directly. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own ambition, forced to maintain an eternal vigil or see Terra itself consumed by demons. Reports of troubles reached him, but distantly, as though through a fog. He learned of conflicts among his sons, of worlds turning traitor, of civil war erupting across the Imperium. But he could not act, could not intervene. All he could do was hold the webway sealed and trust that his loyal sons would handle the crisis. He did not yet understand the full scale of what was happening. He did not know that Horus, his most beloved son, had fallen to chaos. He did not know that half his Primarchs had turned traitor. He did not know that his dream of a united, rational Imperium was about to be destroyed in the fires of the most devastating civil war humanity had ever known. The Horus heresy began with a wound. On the world of Davin, Horus was struck down by a weapon infused with chaos energies. Mortally wounded, he was taken to a lodge of the serpent cult on Davin's moon, where he was subjected to visions and manipulations by the chaos gods. In his fevered visions, Horus saw a future where the Emperor had become a god, worshipped by all humanity, while he and his brothers were forgotten, cast aside now that their usefulness had ended. The vision was a lie, but it was a seductive one. Horus's pride, his feeling of abandonment when the Emperor had left the crusade, made him vulnerable. Horus turned to chaos, swearing allegiance to the ruinous powers in exchange for the strength to overthrow the Emperor and seize control of the Imperium. He was not alone in this betrayal. Lorgar of the Word-Bearers had already been corrupted, having spent decades secretly spreading the worship of chaos. Other Primarchs followed. Angron, already driven mad by the butcher's nails. Mortarion, bitter and resentful. Fulgrim, seduced by the promise of perfection. Perturabo, consumed by jealousy and spite. 8 of the 9 traitor Primarchs turned against the Emperor. The 9th, Alpharius Omegon of the Alpha Legion, followed his own inscrutable agenda, perhaps serving chaos, perhaps serving the Emperor in some twisted way, perhaps serving only himself. Horus moved carefully. He knew that a direct assault on Terra, while the Emperor sat at the heart of his power, would fail. Instead, he began to systematically remove loyalist forces from the equation and gather his strength. The first blow fell at Istvan III. Horus gathered loyalist elements from the traitor legions, those space marines who had remained faithful to the Emperor even as their Primarchs turned, and sent them to the surface of Istvan III to put down a rebellion. Once they were committed to the surface, Horus ordered a devastating virus bombing that killed billions, including most of the loyalist Astartes. Some survived the virus bombing, taking shelter underground or in sealed structures. These survivors, knowing they had been betrayed, fought desperately to stay alive. Horus, unwilling to leave loose ends, sent ground forces to finish them off. The battle raged for months, brother killing brother, in the most bitter fighting imaginable. The second atrocity came at Istvan V, and this one was even more devastating to the loyalist cause. When word of Horus's betrayal reached Terra, the Emperor sent 7 legions to bring the traitors to justice. 4 of these legions, the Iron Hands, Salamanders, Raven Guard, and an Imperial Fists contingent, would form the first wave. 3 more legions, the Iron Warriors, Word Bearers, and Night Lords, would form the second wave. But the Emperor did not know that these second wave legions had also turned traitor. The trap was set perfectly. The first wave landed and engaged Horus's forces in a brutal battle. Just as the Loyalists seemed to be gaining the upper hand, the second wave arrived. But instead of reinforcing the Loyalists, they opened fire on them from behind. The drop site massacre was a slaughter. The Iron Hands Primarch, Ferrus Manus, was killed by Fulgrim in single combat, beheaded before his sons. The Salamanders were scattered and nearly destroyed, their Primarch Vulcan lost. The Raven Guard barely escaped with a fraction of their strength. 3 of the Emperor's legions were effectively eliminated as fighting forces in a single day. The news of the Istvan atrocities reached Terra like a thunderclap. The Emperor, still bound to the Golden Throne, could not fully process the enormity of what had happened. Half his sons had turned traitor. 3 of his loyal legions had been devastated. And Horus, his favorite, the son he had loved most, was leading the rebellion. The Emperor's response was measured but firm. He could not leave the Golden Throne, not without allowing demons to pour through into the Imperial palace. But he could coordinate the defense of the Imperium from Terra. He sent orders to his loyal Primarchs, directing them to fortify their positions and prepare for the coming storm. Robut Guilliman was ordered to hold Ultramar and rebuild what forces he could. Rogel Dawn was recalled to Terra to fortify the Imperial palace. Jagatai Khan was to protect the approaches to Terra. Leman Russ was to hunt down the traitors wherever they could be found. But the Emperor made a critical error. He still did not fully understand the nature of the corruption his sons had embraced. He believed this was a conventional rebellion, driven by ambition and pride. He did not yet grasp that the Chaos Gods themselves were involved, that his sons had been corrupted by entities from the warp, and that this was not merely a civil war, but a war for the soul of humanity. While Horus prepared his march on Terra, other traitor forces waged their own campaigns across the galaxy. Lorgar and Angron led what became known as the Shadow Crusade, a rampage through Ultramar intended to prevent Guilliman from reinforcing Terra. World after world fell to the Word Bearers and World Eaters. Entire planetary populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Angron, now fully given over to Khorne, the Blood God, was becoming something more than a Primarch, something demonic. In a dark ritual on the world of New Syria, Angron ascended to become a demon prince, the first Primarch to fully embrace demonhood. Guilliman fought desperately to hold his realm together, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Word Bearers had been planning this campaign for decades, and they executed it with terrible precision. By the time Guilliman managed to stabilize the situation, Horus was already approaching Terra. In the 7th year of the heresy, Horus's fleet arrived in the Sol system. It was the largest armada ever assembled, hundreds of thousands of ships carrying billions of traitor soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Chaos Space Marines. The traitor Mechanicum brought their unholy war machines, titans the size of buildings, demon engines that defied the laws of reality. The defense of Terra was led by Rogel Dawn, who had spent years fortifying the Imperial Palace and the wider palace complex. The defenses were formidable. Millions of guns, countless bunkers and fortifications, void shields that could withstand orbital bombardment, and garrison forces numbering in the billions. But Horus had numbers, and he had the blessings of the Chaos Gods. The siege began with devastating orbital bombardments, followed by mass landings of traitor forces. The traitors crashed against the walls of the palace like a dark tide, and the defenders held with grim determination. The Emperor, still bound to the Golden Throne, could do nothing but watch through psychic sight as his Imperium burned. He sent what orders he could, what psychic support he could provide, but his attention remained divided. The webway breach still required most of his power to contain. If he abandoned the throne, demons would pour through and consume the palace from within. The siege dragged on for weeks, then months. Slowly, inexorably, the traitors were winning. The outer defenses fell, then the middle rings. The defenders were pushed back toward the inner palace itself. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of millions. Dawn fought brilliantly, using every advantage the defenses provided, making the traitors pay in blood for every meter of ground. But it was not enough. The tide of chaos could not be stopped by walls and guns alone. Then something changed. Horus, aboard his flagship Vengeful Spirit in orbit above Terra, suddenly dropped the void shields protecting his ship. It was a clear challenge, an invitation. The Emperor understood immediately what Horus was doing. His fallen son wanted to end this as it had begun, with a confrontation between father and son. The Emperor made his decision. He would teleport aboard the Vengeful Spirit with a strike force and confront Horus directly. It was a desperate gamble, but the alternative was the slow, grinding destruction of everything he had built. The Emperor assembled his strike force, the Primarch Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, Rogel Dawn, and a company of his most elite guards, the Custodes, and a contingent of Imperial Fists. Together, they teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The interior of Horus's flagship had been transformed by chaos into a nightmarish labyrinth. Reality itself bent and twisted within its corridors. The strike force was scattered by warp interference, each group finding themselves in different sections of the ship. The Emperor walked through corridors that defied geometry, past scenes of horror and torment. He encountered demons and traitor space marines, destroying them with contemptuous ease. His psychic power blazed like a star, burning away the chaos corruption wherever he walked. But the ship resisted him. It was alive in its own way, suffused with the power of the warp. It tried to trap him, to separate him from his allies, to wear him down. The Emperor pressed on regardless, following the psychic beacon that was Horus, his fallen son, the one he had loved most. Sanguinius reached Horus first. The angel, the most beautiful and noble of all the Primarchs, confronted his brother in the throne room of the Vengeful Spirit. Sanguinius had foreseen this moment, had seen visions of his own death. He knew he could not defeat Horus, not as Horus was now, bloated with the power of all four Chaos Gods, transformed into something between Primarch and demon. But Sanguinius fought anyway. He fought because it was right, because someone had to stand against the darkness, because perhaps he could weaken Horus enough for the Emperor to finish what he could not. The battle between Sanguinius and Horus was titanic. Sanguinius wielded the blade Encarmine and the spear of Telesto, weapons of incredible power. He fought with all the skill and fury of a Primarch, his wings carrying him through the air as he struck at Horus from every angle. But Horus was stronger. The power of chaos filled him, made him faster, more powerful than any Primarch had a right to be. He weathered Sanguinius's assault and struck back, his blows shattering armor and breaking bones. In the end, Horus caught Sanguinius and broke him. The angel fell, his back shattered, his wings torn. As Sanguinius lay dying, Horus stood over him and tore out his throat, ending the life of the noblest Primarch in a moment of savage brutality. But Sanguinius had achieved his goal. The fight had weakened Horus, had forced him to expend some of the chaos power sustaining him, and critically, it had bought time for the Emperor to arrive. The Emperor entered the throne room to find Sanguinius's broken body lying at Horus's feet. For a moment, even the Emperor's iron self-control wavered. Sanguinius had been loyal to the end, had fought and died to defend the dream they had all shared. Horus turned to face his father. He was no longer the son the Emperor had known. Chaos had warped him, transformed him into something monstrous. He stood taller than any Primarch, wreathed in dark power, his eyes burning with an unholy light. "Father," Horus said, and his voice held mockery and madness in equal measure, "have you come to kneel before the new Emperor?" The Emperor looked at his son, and in that moment, he saw not just Horus, but all his failures laid bare. He had tried to unite humanity, to lead it to a golden future, but he had neglected the hearts of his own sons. He had used them as tools, had failed to give them the love and guidance they needed, and now the galaxy burned because of it. But there was no time for regrets. Horus had to be stopped, whatever the cost. "Horus," the Emperor said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "you are my son. You can still turn back. You can still reject the corruption that has taken you." Horus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Turn back? To what? To being your obedient tool? To watch you ascend to godhood while I and my brothers are forgotten? No, Father. I have seen the truth. I have embraced the power you denied us, and now I will take your place." The Emperor's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." The duel between the Emperor and Horus was not merely physical, though the physical component was devastating enough. When they clashed, the deck of the ship buckled beneath them. Energy discharges vaporized bulkheads. The very fabric of reality strained under the forces being unleashed. But the true battle was psychic. In the warp, their souls met and warred. The Emperor's vast, ancient consciousness grappled with Horus's chaos-enhanced might. The Chaos Gods themselves lent their strength to Horus. All four of them united in their hatred of the Emperor. Horus struck with the talon of Horus, the massive lightning claw he had carried since his earliest days. The Emperor parried with the sword of the Emperor, a blade of pure psychic energy. They traded blows that could have leveled cities, attacks that existed simultaneously in the material realm and in the warp. The Emperor was stronger, more skilled, more experienced, but he held back. Even now, even facing this corrupted thing that had been his son, he could not bring himself to strike with full force. Some part of him still hoped to redeem Horus, to save the son he had loved. Horus had no such compunctions. He struck with savage fury, using every gift the Chaos Gods had given him. He channeled the rage of Khorne, the decay of Nurgle, the excess of Slanesh, the trickery of Tzeentch. He fought not to defeat the Emperor, but to destroy him utterly. At a critical moment in the battle, another figure entered the throne room. Olanius Pius, or perhaps a custodian, accounts differ, warped by time and myth, stepped between Horus and the Emperor. This mortal man, or post-human warrior, stood before a being of godlike power and refused to yield. Horus, annoyed by this interruption, struck down the interloper with casual contempt. The man died instantly, his body vaporized by chaos energy. But that death changed everything. The Emperor saw the absolute corruption in Horus, the complete absence of mercy or humanity. The son he had known was truly gone, consumed entirely by chaos. There was nothing left to redeem. The Emperor's hesitation vanished. He unleashed his full psychic might, holding nothing back. Golden light blazed forth, the pure anathema to chaos. It burned away the warp energies sustaining Horus, scoured the demonic corruption from his flesh, and struck directly at his soul. Horus screamed as the Emperor's power tore through him. The Chaos Gods, sensing their champion's defeat, tried to withdraw their blessings and save themselves, but the Emperor gave them no chance to escape. He poured more and more power into his attack, pursuing Horus's soul into the warp itself, destroying it so utterly that not even the Chaos Gods could preserve or resurrect it. Horus fell, his body a smoking ruin. The War Master, the once beloved son, was dead, his soul obliterated beyond any hope of recovery. But the victory had come at a terrible price. In those final moments of the duel, Horus had landed blows of his own. The talon of Horus had torn through the Emperor's armor, rending the flesh beneath. Chaos energies had poured into the wounds, corruption that resisted even the Emperor's regenerative abilities. The Emperor collapsed beside Horus's corpse. Rogel Dawn found him there, along with the bodies of Sanguinius and Horus. Dawn immediately ordered the Emperor's body returned to Terra, to the Golden Throne. As the Emperor lay dying, he gave Dawn and Malcador his final instructions. The Imperium must endure. The Astronomicon must continue to shine. Humanity must survive, whatever the cost. The Emperor was placed upon the Golden Throne, and there he remains to this day. He is not quite alive, not quite dead. His body is a withered corpse, sustained by the arcane mechanisms of the throne and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls feed his dying essence, but his mind endures. From the Golden Throne, the Emperor maintains the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows for navigation through the warp. He holds closed the breached webway portal, preventing demons from pouring into the heart of the Imperial Palace, and he watches over humanity, his consciousness stretched across the galaxy, guiding, protecting, inspiring. The defeat of Horus broke the back of the rebellion. The traitor forces, learning of their leader's death, retreated in disarray. The siege of Terra was lifted. The loyalists had won, but at a cost that staggered the imagination. Millions had died in the siege. Entire legions were destroyed or broken. Primarchs were dead or lost. The Imperium had been shattered, its territories torn apart by 7 years of civil war. And the Emperor, who had guided humanity for tens of thousands of years, was reduced to a living corpse upon a golden throne. Rogel Dawn and Robut Guilliman took up the task of rebuilding. They reformed the Imperium's military, breaking the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters to prevent any single leader from commanding so much power. they codified the imperial administration, creating the bureaucratic institutions that would govern the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. But something essential had been lost. The Emperor's vision of a secular, rational Imperium based on science and reason died with him. In the millennia that followed, he became what he had always denied being, a god. The Imperial cult rose, worshipping the Emperor as the God-Emperor of mankind, the one true deity whose sacrifice saved humanity. Whether the Emperor, trapped in his eternal vigil, approves of this worship or rages against it in silent frustration, no one can say. He cannot speak, cannot move, can barely interact with the material world. He is a prisoner of his own throne, a guardian who can never rest, a father who watches his children from an infinite distance. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has sat upon the golden throne. Every day, 1,000 psychers are sacrificed to sustain him, their souls consumed to provide the psychic energy he needs to continue his vigil. Every day, he holds the webway portal closed against the daemonic hordes that press against it. Every day, he maintains the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse by which ships navigate the warp. The Golden Throne is both a life support system and a prison. It keeps the Emperor's body alive after a fashion, but it also binds him to terror. The technology is ancient beyond reckoning, combining human engineering with archaeotech and esoteric knowledge that the Mechanicum can barely comprehend. It is slowly failing, breaking down piece by piece, and no one knows how to fully repair it. Tech priests labor constantly to maintain the throne, replacing components as they fail, performing rituals of appeasement to the machine spirits, desperately trying to keep the Emperor alive. They know that if the Golden Throne fails, if the Emperor finally dies, the consequences would be catastrophic. The webway portal would burst open, allowing demons to pour directly into the heart of terror. The Astronomicon would go dark, plunging the Imperium into darkness and isolation. And perhaps worst of all, the Emperor's psychic presence, which has protected humanity for so long, would be extinguished. The Astronomicon is one of the Emperor's greatest gifts to humanity, and one of his greatest burdens. This psychic beacon shines from terror across the entire galaxy, visible in the warp to navigators who use it to plot their courses through that treacherous realm. Without the Astronomicon, interstellar travel would become vastly more dangerous and uncertain. Ships would take years or decades to travel routes that currently take weeks. The Imperium, which spans 1 million worlds across the galaxy, would fragment into isolated pockets, unable to maintain contact or coordinate their defenses. The Emperor maintains the Astronomicon through sheer force of will, his consciousness perpetually focused on this single task, even as he simultaneously holds the webway closed and performs countless other duties. It is a feat of multitasking and psychic power that no other being in the galaxy could match. Quasi-psychers assist in maintaining the Astronomicon, channeling their own energies through the Emperor to amplify his signal. But the burden ultimately rests on him alone. Every moment of every day for 10,000 years, he has held this beacon lit, a lighthouse for all humanity. Though the Emperor cannot speak or move, he is not entirely powerless. His psychic presence pervades the Imperium, touching the lives of countless billions in ways both subtle and overt. Saints arise, claiming to be blessed by the Emperor's power, performing miracles that cannot be explained by science or reason. Are they truly touched by the Emperor's will, or are they simply powerful psychers deluding themselves? No one knows for certain. Space Marines, when faced with certain death, sometimes report visions of a golden figure guiding them to safety or giving them the strength to fight on. Are these visions real, or products of their own psycho-conditioning and desperate situations? The Space Marines themselves believe the Emperor watches over them. Across the Imperium, people pray to the Emperor in moments of desperation. Sometimes, their prayers seem to be answered. A sudden insight saves a world from invasion. A demon recoils from an unexpected source of holy light. A dying soldier finds the strength for one last act of heroism. Coincidence or divine intervention? The Emperor himself, locked in his eternal vigil, cannot confirm or deny any of this. But the faith of humanity is real, and faith in the warp has power. The Emperor may have rejected divinity, but humanity has made him a god regardless. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that faith may be one of the few things standing between humanity and oblivion. The Emperor's enemies call him the Corpse Emperor, mocking his entombed state. They see his condition as proof of his defeat, his failure. They believe that he clings to existence only through stubbornness and the technological life support of the Golden Throne. But those who truly understand the Emperor know better. His current state is not a defeat, but a sacrifice, a continuation of the same pattern that has defined his entire existence. He has always put humanity's survival above his own comfort, his own desires, even his own life. The Emperor endures not because he fears death, but because humanity still needs him. He maintains his vigil not out of stubbornness, but out of love. A cold, distant, pragmatic love perhaps, but love nonetheless. He is humanity's protector, its guardian against the dark, and he will continue to serve in that role until his last spark of consciousness is extinguished. Some say the Emperor is dying, that the Golden Throne's failure is inevitable. Others believe he is slowly regenerating, gathering his strength for a final rebirth. There are even those who whisper that the Emperor is already dead, and what remains is merely a psychic construct, a collective hallucination maintained by the faith of trillions. The truth remains known only to the Emperor himself, and he cannot speak to share it. Though the Emperor cannot speak directly, he can still communicate in limited ways. The Adeptus Custodes, his personal guardians, claim to receive visions and dreams that guide their actions. The High Lords of Terror interpret signs and portents, believing them to be the Emperor's will made manifest. But these communications are cryptic at best, ambiguous and open to interpretation. Different factions within the Imperium claim the Emperor's backing for contradictory actions. Wars have been fought over different interpretations of what the Emperor would want. This ambiguity is both a strength and a weakness for the Imperium. It allows for flexibility, for local adaptation to different circumstances, but it also leads to conflict, to schisms, to the fracturing of the unity the Emperor once sought to impose. Perhaps this is appropriate. The Emperor always understood humanity's capacity for diversity, for disagreement, for finding multiple solutions to the same problem. Perhaps in his current state, he has no choice but to allow humanity to find its own way, to make its own decisions, even when those decisions lead to conflict and suffering. Or perhaps he rages silently against the misuse of his name, the perversion of his ideals, the transformation of his secular Imperium into a theocratic nightmare. Perhaps every prayer offered to him as a god is a knife in his heart, a reminder of his failure to educate humanity away from superstition. No one knows. No one can know. The Emperor keeps his own counsel, as he always has. The greatest irony of the Emperor's legacy is that he has become precisely what he fought against, a god. The Imperial cult, the state religion of the Imperium, teaches that the Emperor is the one true god, the creator and protector of humanity, worthy of worship and absolute obedience. This development would have horrified the Emperor who walked among men during the Great Crusade. He had seen the damage that religion could do, the ways it could limit human potential and blind people to reality. He had preached the imperial truth, the doctrine that there were no gods, only aliens, an ancient technology misunderstood by primitive minds. But after his interment on the Golden Throne, the imperial cult arose organically from the people's need to make sense of their suffering. They needed to believe that the Emperor's sacrifice had meaning, that his ongoing vigil served a higher purpose. They needed hope, faith, something to cling to in a galaxy that seemed designed to crush humanity at every turn. The ecclesiarchy, the official church of the imperial cult, wields enormous power across the Imperium. Its preachers spread the word of the Emperor's divinity to every world. Its missionaries convert newly discovered human civilizations to the worship of the God Emperor. Its armies, the Sisters of Battle, wage war against heretics and aliens in the Emperor's name. Whether this development represents a complete betrayal of the Emperor's vision or a pragmatic adaptation to reality is a question that has no easy answer. The faith of billions does provide genuine psychic protection against chaos. The unity created by shared belief helps hold the Imperium together across impossible distances. Perhaps in his current state, the Emperor has come to accept or even encourage the worship he once rejected. Or perhaps trapped and voiceless, he silently screams against the irony of his fate. The Space Marines remain the Emperor's greatest warriors, 10,000 years after their creation. They are living relics of the Great Crusade, genetically engineered superhumans who carry the Emperor's gene seed in their bodies. Every Space Marine chapter venerates the Emperor as their ultimate progenitor, the source of their strength and purpose. They call him the Master of Mankind, the Omnissiah, the God Emperor. They study his tactics, his strategies, his philosophies. They seek to embody his will in every action they take. The Space Marines fight across 1,000 battlefields, holding back the endless tide of enemies that threaten to overwhelm humanity. They are the Emperor's vengeance made manifest, his wrath given form. When a Space Marine strikes down a heretic or an alien, he does so in the Emperor's name, believing that he serves a higher purpose. But the Space Marines are also a reminder of the Emperor's failures. The gene seed is not perfect. It degrades over time, develops mutations, causes psychological instabilities. Some chapters suffer from genetic flaws inherited from their Primarchs. The Blood Angel's Red Thirst, the Space Wolf's Canis Helix, the Salamander's altered skin and eyes. And always, there is the risk of falling to chaos, as half the original legions did during the Horus Heresy. New chapters occasionally turn traitor, seduced by the same promises that corrupted their ancient predecessors. The Emperor's sons, both his Primarchs and the Space Marines who carry their gene seed, remain vulnerable to the very forces he sought to protect them from. If the Space Marines are the Emperor's warriors, the Adeptus Custodes are his companions, his true sons in a way that even the Primarchs never were. Each custodian is a work of art, individually crafted by processes that make even the creation of a Space Marine seem crude by comparison. The Custodes have stood guard over the Emperor since before the Unification Wars. They have never wavered, never faltered, never turned traitor. While half the Primarchs fell to chaos, while Space Marine chapters have defected throughout the millennia, the Custodes have remained absolutely loyal. They stand guard in the Imperial Palace, in the throne room itself, watching over the Emperor's failing body. They are the last line of defense against any threat that might reach Terra. And in recent centuries, as the Imperium faces ever greater threats, they have begun to venture out into the galaxy, bringing the Emperor's judgment to his enemies. The Custodes know the Emperor in a way that perhaps no one else does. They have stood in his presence since their creation. They have heard his voice, received his orders, seen his true face before he was entombed. If anyone understands his will, his purpose, his ultimate goals, it is them. But even the Custodes cannot truly speak for the Emperor. They interpret his will through their actions, but they cannot claim to know his thoughts or feelings. The Emperor remains an enigma even to those closest to him. In recent centuries, something unprecedented has occurred. Some of the Primarchs have returned. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, was resurrected from his deathless sleep and now serves as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, attempting to hold together a realm that teeters on the brink of collapse. Guilliman has stood before the Golden Throne. He has gazed upon his father's withered form, and what he saw there filled him with profound sorrow and horror. The Emperor, as perceived by Guilliman, is barely aware, his consciousness so stretched and divided that he can barely focus on the sun standing before him. In that brief communion, Guilliman understood the depth of his father's sacrifice and the terrible price of 10,000 years of constant vigilance. He also understood that the Imperium his father had built has become a twisted mockery of its original vision, a theocratic tyranny built on superstition and oppression rather than reason and progress. But Guilliman also understood that he cannot simply tear down the Imperium and start over. Humanity needs the stability, flawed as it is, that the current system provides. To destroy the Imperial cult would risk shattering the Imperium at a time when it faces existential threats on every front. So Guilliman works within the system, trying to reform it where he can, to make it more efficient, more rational, more humane. But he does so knowing that he is fundamentally limited in what he can achieve, that the Imperium has become something too vast, too entrenched, too dependent on its current structures to be easily changed. Other Primarchs have also returned, though not all as allies. The traitor Primarchs, who fled to the warp after the Horus Heresy, occasionally emerge to lead Black Crusades against the Imperium. They are now fully demon princes, more warp entity than Primarch, and they seek to finish what Horus started and destroy the Emperor's Imperium forever. The stage is set for conflicts that echo the Horus Heresy itself, with Primarchs once again leading armies in war against each other. But this time, the Emperor cannot intervene, cannot lead, cannot even offer counsel. He can only watch from his throne and hope that his remaining loyal sons prove strong enough to prevail. The galaxy is changing. Psychic phenomena are becoming more common, more powerful, more dangerous. Warp storms rage across Imperial space. The Great Rift, a massive tear in reality, splits the galaxy in two, with one half effectively cut off from the Astronomican's light. Some see these developments as signs of the apocalypse, harbingers of humanity's final doom. Others believe they represent a transformation, a psychic evolution of the human species. The Emperor, as the most powerful psyker who has ever lived, may be at the center of this change. There are theories that the Emperor is dying, and his death will trigger a psychic cataclysm that will destroy terror and perhaps reshape the galaxy itself. Others believe that the Emperor is actually regenerating, that his long vigil on the Golden Throne is a form of metamorphosis, and he will eventually emerge reborn and more powerful than ever. Still others whisper that the Emperor never truly existed as a single being, that he is and always has been a psychic gestalt, the collective unconscious of humanity given form. In this interpretation, the Emperor is not dying, but rather evolving along with humanity itself, and what emerges from the Golden Throne may be something entirely new. The truth remains shrouded in mystery, hidden behind layers of dogma, propaganda, and genuine ignorance. Even the highest authorities in the Imperium do not fully understand what is happening to the Emperor or what his ultimate fate will be. What did the Emperor truly want for humanity? After 10,000 years, after his vision has been so thoroughly transformed by history and necessity, it is worth returning to that fundamental question. The Emperor wanted humanity to survive and thrive. He wanted it to be safe from the predatory forces of the galaxy, the Xenos races that would enslave or exterminate it, the demons of chaos that would corrupt it, the darkness of ignorance that would limit it. He wanted humanity to reach its full potential, to evolve into something greater than it was. He saw in humanity the potential for psychic awakening, for a species of psychers who could defend themselves from the warp's dangers while harnessing its power for good. He wanted to eliminate superstition, to replace faith with knowledge, to build a civilization based on reason and science rather than religion and tradition. He believed that only through rational understanding could humanity truly master its own fate. He wanted unity, but not uniformity. He understood that humanity was diverse, that different worlds would develop different cultures and customs, but he believed they needed to be unified in their adherence to core principles, in their loyalty to the species as a whole, in their rejection of the forces that sought to divide and destroy them. In pursuit of these goals, the Emperor was willing to commit terrible acts. He waged wars of extermination against Xenos races that had never threatened humanity. He destroyed human civilizations that refused to bend to his will. He created warriors who knew nothing but war, who would never find peace, even if peace were achieved. The Emperor believed the ends justified the means, that any price was acceptable if it ensured humanity's survival. He was willing to sacrifice billions for the sake of trillions, to destroy in order to build, to impose tyranny in order to prevent chaos. This utilitarian calculus, this absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause, was both the Emperor's greatest strength and his fatal flaw. It allowed him to make the hard decisions, to do what was necessary without hesitation. but it also blinded him to the emotional and spiritual needs of those around him, including his own sons. The Emperor's dream has not been realized. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is not the rational, enlightened civilization he envisioned, but it endures. And in a galaxy as dark and brutal as Warhammer 40,000, perhaps endurance is its own form of victory. Who is the Emperor, really? Is he the cold, calculating tyrant that some accounts portray, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for his grand vision? Is he the benevolent father figure of Imperial propaganda, watching over humanity with infinite love and patience? Is he the tragic hero, undone by his own hubris and the betrayal of those he loved most? The truth is that he is all of these things and none of them. The Emperor is too vast, too complex, too ancient to be easily categorized. He has lived for more than 40,000 years, has played countless roles, has adapted to countless circumstances. To reduce him to a single characterization is to fundamentally misunderstand him. In his youth, before he revealed himself, the Emperor was a wanderer, a guide, a hidden hand pushing humanity toward progress. He was patient then, willing to work over centuries and millennia to achieve incremental improvements. He understood that humanity needed to grow at its own pace, to learn from its own mistakes. During the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, he became a warlord, a conqueror, a tyrant. The age of strife had taught him that patience was no longer enough, that without direct intervention, humanity would destroy itself. He seized power not because he desired it for its own sake, but because he believed it was necessary. With his Primarchs, he tried to be a father, though he was fundamentally unsuited for the role. He had never had children in the conventional sense. He did not understand how to show affection, how to provide emotional support, how to make his sons feel valued for themselves rather than for their utility. His love, if it can be called that, was expressed through expectations and demands rather than comfort and acceptance. On the Golden Throne, he has become something else entirely, a force of nature, a living God, a consciousness so vast and so divided that he can barely be said to exist as a unified individual anymore. He is the Astronomicon, burning across the galaxy. He is the barrier holding back the daemons in the webway. He is the psychic presence that manifests in moments of humanity's greatest need. He is all of these things simultaneously, and he is slowly being consumed by the effort of maintaining them all. The Emperor's psychic power is beyond measurement. He is by far the most powerful psyker humanity has ever produced, and perhaps the most powerful psyker in the galaxy, excepting only the Chaos Gods themselves, who are not truly individuals, but rather vast collective entities, formed from emotions and beliefs. The Emperor can destroy armies with a thought. He can walk through the warp without fear, his presence anathema to the daemons that dwell there. He can look into the future, though what he sees there is clouded and uncertain, shaped by the constantly shifting possibilities of the warp. He can project his consciousness across light years, appearing as a vision or a voice to those who need guidance. But his power comes at a cost. Every use of psychic ability creates ripples in the warp, draws the attention of entities that dwell there. The Emperor's very existence is a beacon in the warp, visible to every demon and chaos god. They hate him with an intensity that is difficult to comprehend, for he represents everything they despise: order, unity, resistance to corruption. The emperor's power is also limited by his physical state. Trapped on the golden throne, most of his strength is devoted to maintaining the Astronomicon and holding the webway closed. He has little left for other purposes. He cannot leave the throne, cannot manifest in the material universe, cannot directly intervene in events, no matter how desperate the situation. This limitation is perhaps the greatest torture of his existence. He can see his Imperium struggling, can see threats that could be easily countered if only he could act, but he is powerless to do anything but watch and hope that others will succeed where he cannot intervene. The Emperor's knowledge is as vast as his power. He has lived through all of recorded human history and much that came before. He has studied sciences, arts, philosophies, and technologies from countless cultures and eras. He has forgotten more than entire civilizations have ever known. This knowledge was the foundation of his greatest achievements. The Space Marines, the Primarchs, the Imperial Webway. All of these required understanding that spanned multiple disciplines, that combined science and warpcraft in ways that even the most brilliant minds of the Mechanicum cannot fully comprehend. But knowledge alone is not wisdom. The Emperor understood genetics, but he did not understand people. He could create perfect warriors, but he could not create happy sons. He knew how to conquer worlds, but he did not know how to govern them in a way that would create lasting peace and prosperity. The Emperor's knowledge also has gaps. The warp is fundamentally chaotic, resistant to complete understanding. The Chaos Gods are ancient beyond measure and cunning beyond mortal comprehension. Despite all his power and all his knowledge, the Emperor did not foresee the Horus heresy. He did not understand how completely chaos could corrupt even his most loyal sons. This failure of knowledge or foresight remains one of the great mysteries of Imperial history. Did the Emperor truly not see the danger? Did he see it but believe he could handle it? Did he see it but make the calculated decision that the risk was acceptable given the potential rewards of completing the Imperial Webway? Or did the Chaos Gods, in their infinite cunning, manage to blind him to the threat, to hide their corruption until it was too late to stop it? The Emperor cannot answer these questions, and no one else knows the truth. What is the Emperor like as a person? This is perhaps the most difficult question to answer, for the Emperor has played so many roles, worn so many masks, that it is unclear whether there is a core personality beneath them all. Those who met him during the Great Crusade describe a being of impossible charisma. He could inspire absolute loyalty with a few words. He could make anyone believe that serving him was the most important thing in the universe. His mere presence filled people with awe and reverence, but this charisma was, in some sense, artificial. The Emperor could appear differently to different people, showing each person the face they needed to see. A warrior would see a magnificent general. A scientist would see a brilliant researcher. A ruler would see a wise statesman. The Emperor was a mirror, reflecting back what others expected or desired. Beneath this adaptability, the Emperor was fundamentally lonely. How could he not be? He had lived for tens of thousands of years, had watched everyone he had ever known grow old and die while he remained unchanging. He had never met an equal, never found someone who could truly understand him or challenge him intellectually. The Primarchs were perhaps his attempt to remedy this loneliness. to create sons who could be his companions and equals rather than merely his followers. But even they fell short. They were powerful, brilliant, magnificent, but they were not like him. They were not immortal in the same way. They had not lived his long life, accumulated his vast experience. They were his children, not his peers. And so the emperor remained alone, even surrounded by billions who would die at his command. He was isolated by his power, his knowledge, his immortality. Perhaps this loneliness is what drove him to take such risks, to push so hard for unity and progress. Perhaps he hoped that if he could elevate humanity to his level, he would finally have companions who could understand him. Or perhaps he was simply pragmatic, focused entirely on humanity's survival without consideration for his own emotional needs. The emperor has always been difficult to read, his true feelings and motivations hidden behind layers of carefully cultivated personas. The emperor's moral framework is utilitarian in the extreme. He judges actions based solely on their consequences, on whether they advance or hinder humanity's survival and progress. Concepts like individual rights, personal autonomy, or inherent human dignity seem to hold little weight in his calculations. He created the Thunder Warriors, knowing they would need to be destroyed. He allowed billions to die in wars of compliance rather than permit worlds to remain independent. He performed genetic experiments that would be considered horrific by any conventional moral standard. He built an empire on conquest, subjugation, and the extermination of any who refused to submit. By conventional moral standards, the emperor is a monster, a tyrant whose crimes against humanity number in the billions. He has caused more suffering than perhaps any other individual in human history, excepting only those who have fallen to chaos. But the emperor would argue that every action, no matter how terrible, was necessary. The galaxy is a hostile place. Humanity faces extinction from 1,000 different threats. Mercy, compassion, individual rights. These are luxuries that can only exist in times of peace and plenty. In times of existential threat, only survival matters, and any action that ensures survival is justified. This moral framework is logically consistent, but emotionally cold. It allows for no exceptions, no mercy for special circumstances. It treats people as resources to be expended, rather than individuals with inherent worth. It is the morality of an immortal being who has seen civilizations rise and fall, who understands that individual lives are brief flickers, while the survival of the species is what truly matters. Whether one accepts this moral framework depends largely on whether one accepts the emperor's fundamental premise, that humanity faces genuine existential threats that justify any measures taken in its defense. The emperor believes this absolutely. Those who serve him accept it. Those who oppose him reject it, arguing that a humanity that survives by becoming monstrous has already lost what made it worth saving. Does the emperor have regrets? Does he lie on the golden throne and reflect on what he could have done differently, the mistakes he made, the opportunities he missed? We cannot know for certain, but it seems impossible that he does not. The emperor is many things, but he is not stupid. He must understand, with 10,000 years of hindsight, where he went wrong. He must regret his treatment of his Primarchs. If he had shown them more affection, more understanding, more trust, if he had explained his plans rather than keeping secrets, perhaps the heresy could have been averted. Horus turned traitor in part because he felt abandoned when the emperor returned to Terra. Magnus broke the Edict of Nicaea because he felt his father did not trust him with the truth about the Webway. He must regret the secrecy surrounding the Webway project. If he had explained to his sons what he was working on, why it was so important, they might have understood his absence. They might have supported him rather than feeling neglected and used. He must regret the destruction of Monarchia, the city that Lorgar had built to worship the Emperor. The Emperor had Guilliman and the Ultramarines destroy the city and force Lorgar and his word-bearers to kneel in its ashes. He meant it as a lesson, a dramatic demonstration that he was not a god and would not tolerate worship. But it backfired spectacularly, driving Lorgar to seek other gods and finding them in the Chaos Pantheon. He must regret countless tactical and strategic decisions during the heresy itself. The deployment of forces, the trust placed in the wrong people, the signs of corruption that were missed or ignored. Every decision that seemed right at the time, but in retrospect, contributed to the disaster that followed. Most of all, perhaps, he regrets his fundamental approach to ruling humanity. The Emperor chose to rule through force and fear, to demand obedience rather than inspire cooperation, to keep secrets rather than build trust. He believed that humanity needed a strong hand to guide it. The transparency would lead to weakness and division. But his empire of secrets and tyranny created the conditions for the heresy. His sons rebelled not despite his authority, but because of it, because they felt controlled and manipulated rather than trusted and valued. The Imperium that survived the heresy is even more tyrannical, more oppressive, more reliant on fear and faith rather than reason and cooperation. If the Emperor could go back and start over, knowing what he knows now, what would he do differently? Would he try to build a more egalitarian society, one based on consent rather than conquest? Would he be more open with his sons, treating them as partners rather than subordinates? Would he take a slower, more patient approach, accepting that progress measured in centuries rather than decades might be more sustainable? Or would he do exactly the same things, believing that despite all the suffering and all the failures, this was still the best possible outcome? That humanity survived when it might have been extinguished, and survival is all that matters. We will never know. The Emperor keeps his thoughts to himself, as he always has, and there is no one left alive who could truly understand the burden he carries. As the 41st millennium draws to a close and the 42nd begins, the Imperium faces its darkest hour. The Great Rift has split the galaxy in two. Chaos forces press against Imperial space from all sides. Xenos empires expand and grow bolder. New threats emerge from the darkness between the stars. And through it all, the Emperor endures on his golden throne, a dying light that refuses to go out. The tech priests who maintain the throne report that its systems are failing faster than ever. Components that have functioned for 10,000 years are breaking down. Repairs that should hold for decades last only years, then months. The daily sacrifice of psychers has increased. Where once 1,000 skers per day were sufficient, now more are needed to sustain the Emperor's fading essence. The black ships scour the Imperium constantly, gathering every psyker they can find, and still it is barely enough. Some believe the Emperor is finally dying, that his long vigil is coming to an end. They debate what will happen when he finally passes. Will there be a final cataclysm, a psychic explosion that destroys terror, and perhaps much more? Will he be reborn, resurrecting as he did in ancient times to lead humanity once more? Will his soul merge with the warp, creating a new chaos god, or perhaps an order god, a force of unity and reason to oppose the ruinous powers? Others believe the Emperor is not dying but transforming, evolving into something new. They point to the increasing frequency of saints and miracles, to the growing psychic awakening among humanity, as evidence that the Emperor is becoming more active despite his physical state. There are even those who believe the Emperor is already dead, that he died long ago, and what remains on the throne is merely an psychic echo sustained by the faith of trillions. In this view, the Emperor has become precisely what he denied being, a god in truth, sustained not by physical life, but by the belief and worship of his followers. Whatever the truth of his condition, it cannot be denied that events occur throughout the Imperium that seem to bear the Emperor's touch. These miracles are reported from thousands of worlds, by millions of witnesses, and while many are surely delusions or fabrications, some are harder to dismiss. Living saints arise, individuals who manifest incredible powers and perform feats that defy explanation. They lead armies to victory against impossible odds, heal the sick with a touch, stand unharmed in the midst of deadly fire. They claim to act with the Emperor's blessing, to be vessels of his will. The Sanguinor, a mysterious golden armored figure, appears in the Blood Angel's darkest moments, fighting alongside them and vanishing when the battle is won. Is it a warp manifestation, a psychic projection of the Emperor, or something else entirely? Space Marines and Imperial Guard soldiers report visions of a golden figure in their darkest moments, standing behind them in battle, pointing the way to safety, lending them strength when they should have fallen. Are these visions real, or products of exhausted minds seeking comfort in familiar imagery? Across the Imperium, people pray to the Emperor, and sometimes their prayers seem to be answered. A dying child recovers from a disease that should have been fatal. A lost ship finds its way home through a warp storm that should have destroyed it. A planetary governor makes a decision that saves millions, guided by what he swears was the Emperor's voice in his mind. Scientists and rationalists dismiss these accounts as coincidence, confirmation bias, and wishful thinking. The ecclesiarchy proclaims them as proof of the Emperor's divinity and active intervention in human affairs. The truth, as always, is difficult to determine. But one thing is certain: belief in the Emperor has power. In a universe where the warp responds to emotion and faith, where entire gods can be born from collective belief, the faith of trillions of humans focused on the Emperor must have some effect. Whether that effect is the Emperor himself acting through the warp, or whether it is a psychic construct created by faith and given apparent life, the result is largely the same. The Emperor protects, whether he wishes to or not, whether he is truly alive or merely a legend given form by faith. The belief that he protects has power. And in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes belief is enough. The Emperor's most direct legacy is the vast military force that fights in his name. The Imperial Guard, numbering in the billions, wages war across 1 million worlds. The Space Marines, his genetically engineered warriors, strike at humanity's greatest enemies. The Imperial Navy patrols the void between stars. the Sisters of Battle burn heretics in his name. All of these forces believe they fight for the Emperor, that they serve his will, that they are the instruments of his judgment. The cry for the Emperor rings out across countless battlefields, a war cry that has echoed across 10,000 years of constant warfare. But these forces do not always serve the Emperor's original vision. The Space Marines have become as much mythic knights as practical soldiers, bound by rituals and traditions that sometimes hinder as much as help. The Imperial Guard is vast, but often poorly equipped and led. The Ecclesiarchy's forces fight with faith and fury, but little tactical sophistication. Would the Emperor approve of how his military has evolved? Would he be pleased by the devotion his soldiers show, or frustrated by their inefficiency and superstition? There is no way to know. But the Emperor's soldiers fight on, believing with absolute conviction that they serve the greatest being humanity has ever known. That faith makes them formidable beyond what their mere numbers and equipment would suggest. An Imperial Guard soldier who believes the Emperor watches over him will stand his ground when a rational calculation would suggest retreat. A Space Marine who believes he fights for the God Emperor will endure wounds that should be fatal, driven by faith to complete his mission. This is both the strength and the tragedy of the Imperium in the 41st millennium. It has the faith and devotion the Emperor rejected, but that faith gives it the strength to endure horrors that would have broken the secular Imperium he envisioned. The Emperor's enemies are legion, and they have not forgotten him despite 10,000 years. The Chaos Gods hate him with a passion that transcends mortal understanding. He is the anathema, the one being in the galaxy who poses a genuine threat to their dominance. They would see him destroyed utterly, his soul scattered across the warp, his works unmade, his name forgotten. The traitor Primarchs who serve chaos wage their black crusades against the Imperium, seeking to finish what Horus started. They want to tear down the Emperor's empire, to shatter it completely, to prove that their betrayal was justified and that the Emperor's dream was always doomed to fail. Xenos races like the Eldar have complicated relationships with the Emperor. They remember him from the Great Crusade, when he waged war against them and drove them from worlds they had held for millennia. Some Eldar seers understand that humanity needs the Emperor to survive, that his death would unleash chaos that might consume them as well. Others would gladly see him die, viewing him as a Monkey tyrant whose empire is built on xenocide. The Orcs, Tyranids, and Necrons care nothing for the Emperor as an individual. They are threats not because they hate him specifically, but because they are fundamentally opposed to human existence. They would devour or exterminate humanity, whether the Emperor lived or not. But it is the Chaos Gods who remain his truest enemies, who have opposed him for tens of thousands of years, who orchestrated the Horus heresy and continue to corrupt and undermine the Imperium. They cannot kill him directly. His psychic presence is too powerful, too well defended. But they can slowly destroy everything he built, can corrupt his Imperium from within, can turn his own creations against him, and time is on their side. The Emperor is trapped, weakening, slowly fading. The Imperium grows more corrupt, more chaotic, more dystopian with each passing century. Eventually, the Chaos Gods believe the Emperor will die, the Imperium will crumble, and humanity will be theirs to devour or enslave as they please. unless something changes, unless the Emperor finds a way to break free of his prison, unless his loyal sons and servants find a way to turn the tide, unless the faith of humanity itself becomes a weapon powerful enough to challenge the Chaos Gods. The future is unwritten, clouded in the mists of the warp. But one way or another, the Emperor's story is not yet finished. Viewed through the lens of tragedy, the Emperor is perhaps the most tragic figure in all of Warhammer 40,000. He was the most powerful, most knowledgeable, most capable being humanity had ever produced. He had tens of thousands of years to perfect his plans. He assembled resources beyond imagining. He created sons who were demigods in their own right. And yet, despite all of this, despite all his power, all his wisdom, all his preparation, he failed. The Imperium he created is a nightmare, a brutal theocracy that would horrify the rational, secular emperor of the Great Crusade. Half his sons turned traitor and either died or fled into the warp. The other half are dead, lost, or only now beginning to return to an Imperium they barely recognize. The Emperor lies trapped on the Golden Throne, unable to die, unable to live, forced to watch as his dream is slowly corrupted into something he would have fought against. He is a prisoner of his own success, bound to terror by the very webway project that was supposed to free humanity from its dependence on the warp. This tragedy is made worse by the fact that so much of it was avoidable. The Emperor's failures were not failures of power or knowledge, but failures of emotional intelligence, of communication, of trust. He could have treated his sons as partners rather than tools. He could have explained his plans rather than working in secrecy. He could have built a foundation of cooperation and mutual understanding rather than one of authority and obedience. But he didn't. Perhaps because he couldn't. Perhaps his immortality, his vast power, his tens of thousands of years of experience had made him fundamentally unable to relate to others as equals. Perhaps he had been alone for so long that he no longer knew how to truly connect with anyone. And so the tragedy unfolded, as it always must. The hero undone not by external enemies, but by his own flaws, his own limitations, his own inability to be more than he was. But there is another way to view the Emperor's story. Perhaps he was not a tragic failure, but rather a necessary tyrant, a figure who made the hard choices that no one else could make, who sacrificed everything, including his own humanity, in order to give humanity a chance to survive. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 is not a place where democracy and enlightenment can easily flourish. It is a universe of constant war where every other species either wants to exterminate humanity or enslave it. The Chaos Gods wait in the warp, ready to corrupt and consume any psyker who lacks proper discipline. The darkness between the stars is filled with threats beyond number. In such a universe, perhaps a tyrant is necessary. Perhaps only absolute authority, ruthlessly applied, can hold humanity together. Perhaps the Emperor understood this from the beginning, understood that his vision of a rational, secular Imperium was always going to be temporary, a stepping stone towards something else. The Emperor may have known that he would end up on the Golden Throne. Some sources suggest he had visions of possible futures, that he saw multiple paths and chose the one that gave humanity the best chance of survival, even knowing it would cost him everything. If this is true, then the Emperor's story is not one of tragic failure, but of ultimate sacrifice. He gave up his freedom, his mobility, his very life to become humanity's eternal guardian. He sits on the golden throne, not because he is trapped, but because he chooses to, because someone must hold back the dark, and he is the only one who can. In this interpretation, the Emperor is not diminished by his imprisonment, but rather elevated by it. He becomes a truly mythic figure, the guardian who stands eternal watch, who sacrifices everything for the sake of those he protects. He becomes, despite his protests, genuinely worthy of worship, not as a god in the traditional sense, but as the embodiment of humanity's will to survive. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that we simply do not know enough about the Emperor to truly judge him. He is the most enigmatic figure in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. His origins are shrouded in myth. His motivations remain unclear. His true nature is a subject of endless debate. We do not know if the Emperor is truly alive or dead. We do not know if his consciousness remains intact or has fragmented across the warp. We do not know if he can hear prayers or if he intervenes in human affairs. We do not know what he thinks about the Imperium that bears his name. We do not even know if there is a single unified entity that we can call the Emperor. Perhaps he has always been a collective consciousness, the gestalt of human psychic potential. Perhaps he has become one through 10,000 years on the golden throne, his individual identity dissolving into something vaster and less personal. The Emperor is, in many ways, the ultimate unreliable narrator of his own story. Every account of his deeds comes filtered through the perceptions of those who witness them, and the Emperor was known to appear differently to different observers. He showed each person the face they needed to see, spoke to each person in the way most likely to achieve his goals. So who is the real Emperor? The cold tyrant, the loving father, the tragic hero, the necessary monster, the dying god, the eternal guardian? Perhaps he is all of these things. Perhaps he is none of them. Perhaps the question itself is meaningless, trying to impose human categories on a being who has transcended humanity in every meaningful sense. Regardless of who or what the Emperor truly is, his symbolic importance to the Imperium cannot be overstated. He is the foundation upon which the entire structure of Imperial society rests. He is the source of all authority, the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, the measure against which all humans are judged. Every Imperial citizen, from the highest Lord Commander to the lowliest factory worker, lives their life in the Emperor's shadow. His image is everywhere, on coins, on banners, on the walls of every official building. His words, or what are claimed to be his words, are quoted to justify every action, every law, every war. The Emperor is the Imperium, and the Imperium is the Emperor. The two are so intertwined that they cannot be separated. To question the Emperor is to question the Imperium itself, to risk being branded a heretic and facing execution. This symbolic power has allowed the Emperor's influence to persist long after his ability to directly govern ended. Even trapped on the golden throne, unable to speak or move, he remains the ultimate authority. Factions fight over what the Emperor would want, how he would judge various courses of action, whether their interpretation of his will is correct. This creates both stability and conflict. The stability comes from having a single, unquestionable source of authority that all factions must at least nominally respect. The conflict comes from the fact that this authority cannot actually speak for himself, leaving his will open to interpretation and manipulation. The Imperium functions despite the Emperor's incapacity because the symbol of the Emperor is more important than the reality. What matters is not what the Emperor actually thinks or wants, but what people believe he thinks or wants. The idea of the Emperor is what holds the Imperium together, and that idea is powerful enough to sustain a galaxy-spanning empire across 10,000 years of constant crisis. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Emperor is what his story warns us about. He represents the danger of messianic leadership, of placing too much faith in a single individual, no matter how powerful or wise they might be. The Emperor believed he knew what was best for humanity. He believed his vision was the only path to survival. He believed that his power and knowledge made him uniquely qualified to rule. And in believing these things, he created an empire that was fundamentally fragile, dependent on his personal presence and authority. When the Emperor fell, the Imperium nearly fell with him. Only through desperate improvisation and enormous sacrifice was it held together. And the Imperium that survived is a twisted mockery of what the Emperor intended, suggesting that perhaps his vision was never as solid or inevitable as he believed. The Emperor's story suggests that no one person, no matter how powerful, can carry the burden of an entire species. That trying to do so leads inevitably to failure, to tragedy, to the corruption of whatever ideals motivated the attempt in the first place. It suggests that secrets and lies, even when motivated by pragmatic concerns, undermine the very foundations they are meant to protect. The Emperor's secrecy about the Chaos Gods, about the Webway project, about his true nature and intentions, created the conditions for the heresy. It suggests that power without empathy, knowledge without wisdom, strength without compassion, will always ultimately fail. The Emperor had all the practical capabilities necessary to achieve his goals, but he lacked the emotional and spiritual understanding necessary to do so in a sustainable way. These are uncomfortable lessons, but they are important ones. The Emperor is not meant to be simply admired or worshipped. He is meant to be understood in all his complexity, his strengths and his failures, his achievements and his catastrophic mistakes. And so we come to the end of our journey through the life and legacy of the Emperor of mankind. From his birth 40,000 years ago, through his long hidden existence, guiding humanity from the shadows, through his revelation and the unification wars, through the Great Crusade and the heights of his power, through the tragedy of the Horus Heresy and his entombment on the Golden Throne, to his current state as the dying god of a crumbling Imperium. The Emperor has been many things: warrior, scientist, tyrant, father, god, corpse, symbol, warning. He has built and destroyed, created and killed, saved and damned. His influence has shaped the lives of countless trillions across 10,000 years. His legacy will endure long after his physical form has finally failed. Whether that legacy represents humanity's salvation or its damnation remains an open question. The Imperium the Emperor created is a nightmarish place of endless war, brutal oppression, and crushing ignorance. But it is also the only thing standing between humanity and total extinction at the hands of chaos, xenos, and the countless other threats that infest the galaxy. Perhaps that is the ultimate truth about the Emperor. He represents humanity itself, in all its complexity and contradiction, its capacity for greatness and its capacity for horror, its will to survive and its tendency towards self-destruction, its dreams of enlightenment and its fear of the dark. The Emperor is humanity made manifest, humanity's collective potential compressed into a single being. He is everything we could be, for good and for ill. He is our greatest hope and our worst nightmare, our protector and our tyrant, our God and our victim. And he endures as humanity endures, clinging to existence despite overwhelming odds, refusing to surrender no matter how dark things become, maintaining the eternal vigil that has defined his entire existence. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Emperor watches from his golden throne. Unable to speak, unable to move, slowly dying over the span of millennia, he nevertheless persists. The Astronomicon burns, the webway remains sealed, humanity survives. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has protected his species, sacrificing everything to give humanity a chance to endure. For 10,000 more years, he may continue this vigil, or he may finally pass into whatever lies beyond death for a being such as him. But whether he lives or dies, whether he is reborn or extinguished, whether he ascends to true godhood or fades into myth, one thing is certain: the Emperor's story is humanity's story. His fate and ours are intertwined, inseparable, bound together until the very end. The Emperor protects. This is the first and last truth of the Imperium. Whether through direct intervention or through the faith he inspires, whether as a living being or as an undying symbol, the Emperor stands as humanity's guardian against the darkness. And in a galaxy where the night is deep and filled with horrors beyond imagining, where every light eventually flickers and dies, where hope itself is a fragile and precious thing, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be. Rest now, traveler. Let the tale of the Emperor wash over you like the waves of an ancient sea. Close your eyes and drift, secure in the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness between the stars, on a throne of gold and suffering, the Emperor maintains his eternal watch, and he will continue to watch until the last star gutters out, until the last human draws their final breath, until the very end of all things. For the Emperor is eternal, and his vigil will never end. The Emperor protects, always,